I'll move us on into the next section of today, where we will be hearing about some of these challenges. We've got a great lineup of speakers. We have 2 speakers in the room and 2 speakers online. So to begin with, we're going to be joined again by Zoe Crutchfield, Head of Licensing Operations, the head of the Licensing Operations team in the Scottish Government. We'll also be joined by Ian Salisbury, Senior Policy Advisor for Strategic Compensation and Impacts for Offshore Wind at DEFRA. And then from the online perspective, we'll be joined by Tristan Bromley, Whole of Seabed Programme Manager at the Crown Estate. And finally, Adrian Judd, who is a Principal Advisor on Evidence for the Marine Management and Policy at CFAS. And Adrian's going to be bringing an ICES perspective to discussions, and ICES have been looking at this for a long time. So first of all, I'd like to welcome up Zoe to begin to share some of her perspectives from Scottish Government point of view on cumulative effects assessment. Thanks, Zoe.
Right, hello everyone. Hope you're all doing fine today. No flashy now stars today, you'll be pleased to hear. But I'll give you a little bit of an overview of some things that trouble me about cumulative effects assessment and a little bit of work we're doing to try to progress some solutions, which I think is where we're all focused. All right. So one of the things about cumulative effects is I think about this as well in terms of all of the different things that we have to think about when we're making decisions, okay? So as I said yesterday, I'm right at the pointy end of the decision making. Our team are writing recommendations, the team, as you said earlier, which I quite like. You know, we are writing recommendations to ministers to make a determination on projects. And one of the things that we have to do when we do that is to look at all the different policies that are out there. So I know we focused a lot yesterday on talking about birds and fisheries and benthic and all that kind of, I just want to sort of make you aware of all of the different policies that are there, and what we're trying to do with our recommendations is to take into account of all of this work, all of this strategy, both at the UK level and at the Scottish Government level when we're making our decisions. So we're thinking about things like the commitment to net zero by 2045. In Scotland, we have that commitment of 2045 rather than 2050 in the rest of the UK, about tackling the climate and biodiversity crises. So we've got commitments there in terms of restoring, being nature positive by 2030 and then restoring biodiversity by 2045. So we'll need to get on with that, I think. Commitments to restore and regenerate our environment. We've got the UK Marine Strategy, we've got our Environment Strategy for Scotland, we've got our Blue Economy Vision. And then we've also got this bit of work going on, which is, there was a consultation on recently, which is the Energy Strategy and Just Transition Plan. And that's a lot about some of the things we were talking yesterday about the social license to do some of this work. You know, it's about the why we're moving our energy strategy to net zero, renewable techniques or renewable technology, and what that means for other users of the sea and for the marine environment, nature conservation, all those kind of topics. We're not moving. Oh, here we go. So just to focus on our Blue Economy Vision. So I think it's worth just mentioning this because this is about what we want to try to achieve by 2045 in Scotland. So it's shared stewardship of our marine environments, which supports ecosystem health, improved livelihoods, economic prosperity, social inclusion and well-being. And that's really important. It's about that kind of making sure that we're taking into account everyone's views, everyone's needs for the marine environment. But we also want to make sure that in doing that, we restore our environment, we make sure it's resilient to climate change, and it's sustainably managed. And the diagram on the right-hand side, okay, just shows you some of the uses that we've got in our marine environment. Now, not all of those are under the control of the Scottish Government. Things like oil and gas is a reserved issue. It's not a devolved issue to Scottish ministers. So for us, in terms of this kind of cumulative effect and how we manage that, it's quite difficult because we don't, I think someone else was talking about this yesterday, we don't actually manage all of those activities in the sea. You know, it's only some of them that we've got control over, and some of them that we've got the ability to actually manage the cumulative effects from. I talked about this a bit yesterday, strategic plans. So for me, this is really, really vital in cumulative impact assessment, and no pressure, Rebecca. Okay, but what I want to see coming out of these strategic plans, so coming out of our National Marine Plan 2, coming out of our sectoral marine plans and our regional plans, is that really meaningful assessment of cumulative effects. Okay, really trying to think about that layers of different activities we've got going on, and how someone like myself and my team can actually use these to make decisions. National Marine Plan 2, I think, is really important here in terms of those of you who know our existing marine plan. It's good. It's a first, you know, it's our first one. It was in 2015. But what it is it's the seas can be used by everybody everywhere, and we all just need to cooperate and we can find a way forward. Now, that's a good message, but I'm not sure it's as realistic as it needs to be. You know, so what I'm pushing for with our National Marine Plan 2 is that we have some more frameworks in there to really help our decision making. So thinking about frameworks, I think what we need to think about in terms of cumulative effects, and as I said, I'm right at the pointy end, I'm at the EIA stage when we're trying to make decisions. And what I'm thinking about with cumulative effects is having these really kind of agreed assessment frameworks that we can use as our in our advice on scoping documents. So right at the start of an application, the applicant will come in with a scoping report and we will give them advice. We will give them a scoping opinion. And what I want to be able to do within that scoping opinion is give them some really set advice. This is what we want you to go and do. This is how we want you to do assessments. This is what we want you to take into account. What happens then is we get really clear guidance, we've got an agreed framework, everyone does things the same way, and we've got this consistent approach, which means that we can then really start to compare and contrast and understand the impacts of proposed developments. One of the things we've suffered from in the last few years is we've got lots of different ways of doing all these assessments, and that really doesn't help us when it comes to understanding the cumulative effects and making decisions. So, I mean, this is just an example that, you know, I might have chosen fisheries because my friend Raymond's here and he raised it yesterday. But I mean, you can see that as we go through the assessment process, you know, something like looking at the socioeconomic impacts of changes relating to the fishing industry and then coastal communities. And this is a really basic example. We need to understand where the fish are. Then we need to understand what's going to be built, okay? And I know that sounds really easy, but actually as a developer, quite often in that early stage of the process, you're not really quite sure what you're going to build because you've got to understand the seabed conditions. You've got to understand what size of project you're going to be able to build out there. You've got to understand the kind of economics of it all. So we end up with these quite wide envelopes at the start of the process. So that builds the uncertainty. You know, it builds the kind of lack of clarity on what the impacts and the overall cumulative impact may be. Then there's how many multiples of these are going to be built. So, you know, at the moment we're doing our sectoral marine plan. Hopefully that will give us a bit more of a kind of overview of our cumulative impacts, but it's something that breeds another level of uncertainty into the assessments. Then we look about what's the impact on the actual fish species. So, you know, we talked a bit about this yesterday, about the difference between fish and commercial fisheries. So we need to understand what the impact on the species is. Then if we understand the impact on the species, do we then understand what that knock-on impact means on the impact on the commercial fisheries of people that are out there targeting those species? Right, if we can understand that, and you can see how we're just getting more and more kind of uncertainty in our assessments here. If we can understand that, then can we put that back to where that impact is on local communities? And it could be at our local level, our regional level, our national and our international communities. So you can see, I'm just trying to give you an example of how we just keep, you know, the uncertainty grows as we go through a process. And then if we look at something like that local community socioeconomics, at the same time as you've maybe got impacts on one of your main industries, you've also got other impacts coming through supply chains, ports and harbours development, and the grid connections that Colin was talking about earlier. So that's just a kind of, just to give you a bit of a, you know, a really kind of basic example of when you're thinking about cumulative effects, all the different stuff that you might have to consider at that kind of social side of things. So where are the evidence gaps? I don't think this isn't rocket science. I don't think this is going to be news to any of you. You know, ornithology, it's about the cumulative effects of multiple projects. Okay, so it's about the effect across not only the Scottish waters, UK waters, international waters, and how we pull those all together so that we've got at the end of it a meaningful assessment. Benthic ecology, cumulative effects of electromagnetic fields, I think is one of our key evidence gaps at the moment. And again, you're looking at massive grid improvement works. You're looking at a huge update on the grid system. And that is going to have impacts in terms of, you know, where the cables are going, potentially MF, disturbance impacts, all those kind of things. So we need to really understand the cumulative effects there. And then underwater noise and habitat loss. So as we get more and more projects in the water, what does that mean? And I think it's quite useful, some of the insight work that was done in oil and gas about that, the more structures you have, how are those linked together, and what that means as a cumulative. And then fish and fisheries, cumulative pressures, impacts on the fish, shellfish, and then the knock-on impact of that on commercial fisheries. So what do we want to do? Well, as I was saying earlier, what we really need is these consistent assessment frameworks, this way of all doing things the same way and doing it at scale and at project level. And so I think we have been working with others in the room on our cumulative effects framework. And this is a tool, okay, to bring together all of the different, maybe not all of them, but some of the different methodologies that have been used for bird and marine mammal impact assessment. So those things like the collision risks, the population viability. And as I said earlier, what we're trying to get here is transparent, repeatable, consistent, flexible, clear audit trail. We're trying to get tools that can be used, that can be replicated over and over again, can be used in the impact assessments, can be used at strategic level, and give us that really kind of combined overview of what cumulative effects are consistently used across both applicants and regulators. And how are we going to use the cumulative effects tool in Scotland? Well, we're going to use it to estimate project level effects, to inform project level applications. We're going to use it to inform our cumulative effects and look at the strategic environmental assessments. We're going to be using it to look at cumulative effects for scenario mapping and to inform policy and planning decisions. And what we want to do is we want to keep developing that cumulative effects framework so that actually it can be used as a kind of model of a good practice in terms of, you know, the birds and the marine mammals and the way that assessment can be taken forward, and how can we use that type of assessment framework for other receptors that we've got out there. And I'll stop there. Once again, thank you for colleagues for their input into the presentation.
Thank you, Zoe. It's always good to hear about the great work going on in Scotland again. You raised a lot of good points around multiple frameworks being a challenge, and it's great to see Scotland have developed a single cumulative effects framework. I also know from chatting to the researchers in the room over the last number of months, there are lots of other cumulative effects assessment for frameworks in development too. So it'll be interesting to hear about those over the course of the day as well, and the challenges that brings too. So move us on to hear a view from Ian Salisbury in DEFRA, who's going to be sort of opening up a little bit around some of the work going on in DEFRA around this, but also with a focus on strategic compensation. Is that right? Brilliant. Great. Thanks, Ian.
First time I use one of these. Thank you, everyone. Morning. So I'm Ian Salisbury. I'm a policy advisor for Offshore Wind Environmental Enablement Actions Programme in DEFRA. This is mainly going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the different things that are happening within OWEC and a little bit on Marine Spatial Prioritisation Programme to try and, I suppose, contribute to easing some of the issues within consenting for offshore wind, whilst trying to manage any trade-offs with the environmental impacts and hopefully find co-benefits so we can accelerate offshore wind whilst actually continue to support the MPA network. The slides, a little disclaimer, don't allow your legal experts to write slides, is one thing I've learned. So if you can spot quite verbose slides, I apologise, particularly toward the end. So first, under the Offshore Wind Enabling Actions Programme, we have those different arms. If I'm going to take you through the different sections to the programme. First is the Offshore Wind's environmental standards, and this is all about, I'm sure everyone's heard of the mitigation hierarchy. Environmental standards in particular is looking at avoidance, reduction and mitigation. So, and trying to come up with clear guidance, both mandatory and voluntary, for developers for what is expected of them to best avoid impact in the first place. These standards seek to reduce the application engagement of statutory nature conservation bodies. So at the moment, we've got long conversations going between SNCBs and developers, and a lot of repeated conversations. So we're trying to build upon, you know, the outcomes, the learning from those conversations, and actually, well, we know that there's minimum standards, let's capture them, let's make them mandatory where they need to be. And they're targeted at 3 main receptors, so birds, benthic ecology and marine mammals, and it'll apply to all future offshore wind developments from early 2025. Worth particularly mentioning is the work that they're doing on minimising underwater noise. So one of the key focuses is introducing a noise limit, particularly recognising the impact that it has on marine mammals. There's new policies and guidance to minimise noise impact from unexploded ordnances, which anyone involved in, I suppose, the marine side will know is a massive issue at the moment with development and the impacts it has on cetaceans, and also certain fish as well. And also helping to support the development of clearer, quieter methods. So that also actually extends, so I'm going slightly off slide, extends to some of the work they're doing around minimising the noise around piling, and some really interesting innovative technologies out there. Tash, who leads on this, I know is often travelling around to meet different people to see the latest things happening in bubble curtains and quiet unexploded ordnance explosive technologies. And then actually that cutting edge technology, how do we bring that into our legislation and into our guidance? And we're investigating and designing further interventions to minimise the impact of underwater noise from all activities. Next is the area I particularly work on, which is strategic compensation. The big focus on this, many people have heard of CAUSC, which is the Collaboration on Offshore Wind Strategic Compensation. So that's bringing together DEFRA, Department for Energy, the nature conservation bodies, ENGOs, developers, and some academics as well, all into the room to discuss the issues around compensation. And in particular, it's focused on strategic compensation, which is the consideration of other things that we can do at a larger scale, using multiple developers, multiple projects, that we couldn't do if it was just at a project level. And also considering other things that government can do to count as compensation that wouldn't be available to a sole developer. The CAUSC is split into, at a working level, into different expert groups. So that was looking at the main features that we think are likely to be impacted and have compensation requirements going forward in the marine environment. So that's the protected habitats and species that are most likely to be impacted by offshore wind in MPAs. And we looked at different sort of thematic drivers for potential compensation. So artificial nesting structures, habitat creation and restoration, predation reduction, prey enhancement and seabed recovery, and the removal of redundant and coastal and marine infrastructure. They're the main expert groups at the moment. We just finished the first year of our programme. I'd say we've really just started to get onto our feet and start to see the first recommendations from the expert groups. And we've got the first idea of what our initial strategic compensation measures are going to be. The next steps for that, and once those measures are going into a library of strategic compensation. And we talked here about we need to obtain ministerial sign-off. So we've got the initial recommendations. They're going up to the minister within the next 2 weeks. Then develop an implementation framework for the library of strategic compensation measures. So the big picture view of this, and one of the ways it can really drive, I suppose, faster consenting, is when it's coupled with the Marine Recovery Fund, which we'll get onto. But the idea of that is that there'll be a central fund that developers can pay into that goes towards these larger, strategic, more targeted compensation measures that can actually already be underway and being delivered before developers are paying into them. So it speeds up the process. Focus on developing the library of compensatory measures. So we're making a start, but actually, well, we're going to be building offshore wind for at least the next couple of decades, hopefully, all being well. So compensatory measures that go into the library, they might not be fit for purpose throughout. One of the things we talk about, the evidence needs for us at the moment, is understanding what is the total capacity of some of these things. So we have offshore wind, artificial nesting structures, where that's highly dependent, we know already on the location and what the limiting factor is to population growth for that species at that location. Where are the best locations? What is the total capacity of that measure? And at what point would we have to say, actually, you've got shrinking returns here, it's no longer an effective compensation measure. So some of these will have a lifespan on them within the library. We need to further develop that understanding and evidence. And fill in the evidence gaps for measures that have been agreed by CAUSC. So again, there's one of the things we're talking about is predation reduction. Well, predation reduction, we know predator eradication, predator control, biosecurity, it can be done, it is being done, it has massive benefits for seabirds. Where are the best locations to do it? And there is, at this point, still evidence gaps. So there's some great papers, particularly Stanbury 2018, I think it was, that went round monitoring where all the invasive predators are on UK islands. Actually, it needs updating. When we've still got a lot of this information, if we've got it, it's fast going out of date as well. Related, environmental assessment reform. So, and again, you can tell where the legal experts started drafting the slides. It gets worse. Environmental assessment reform is all about looking at the habitats regulations assessments and the marine conservation zone assessments. So the different MPAs that are protected, different legislation, they're, as much as possible, we try to treat them as the same within the MPA network, but there is different legislation and it does affect the way in which we can look at compensation. It also has, I suppose, quite tight bearing on what is permissible under the law as effective compensation. So one of the things that we've committed to in the Environment Act was to have another look at this and say, okay, can we make the guidance clearer on how to do habitats regulations assessment? And Zoe touched on some really great points as well about some issues, live issues in undertaking those assessments. But then once you've done the assessments as well, guidance on how developers can go about pulling together their compensation actions and compensation plans. And then we're asking the question of, is it the most effective way? Are the current requirements around compensation options, are they following the spirit of the legislation? And do we need to consider making any changes to hopefully expand the number of compensation options available without risking environmental regression within the MPA network? Marine net gain is very much in this space. It's sequentially, it's coming down the line later than the rest of it. But this is a really large part of our ambitions for the future of the marine network, so that we can make sure that any new developments in the UK seas are not only ensuring no net loss, but are leaving the marine environment better than they found it. So in places that are already covered by strategic compensation, you'll probably see a case of where the strategic compensation is around no net loss. Marine net gain is, okay, how do you go further? How do you go? It can also has a slightly wider remit than strategic compensation. Strategic compensation is, under current legislation, is very much focused on the specific habitats and species that are protected, marine net gain can be a little bit more holistic in its views. Embedding environmental improvement in infrastructure planning and development build on the mitigation hierarchy. So in some places that actually, if your impact is falling outside of the protected habitats and species or outside of MPAs, you're not covered by strategic compensation. So marine net gain provides some similar level of emphasis on developers that are impacting outside of MPAs to still have to ensure no net loss and then go further where possible. Marine net gain has had a consultation recently. The summary of responses is going to be published soon as well. So I'm just trying to check I haven't missed anything. Marine Recovery Fund. I've touched briefly on this, so I won't go too much into it, but we're saying, as I mentioned before, we're currently working on the assessment of the Marine Recovery Fund delivery options. So what could it look like? Who would deliver it? What would the responsibilities, the different responsibilities fall to? We've put out a request for information, giving stakeholders and the end users opportunities to contribute to our current thinking on this as we continue to develop this policy. And in advance of the MRF becoming operational, we're considering whether the strategic measures proposed by CAUS could be delivered as an interim solution. So there is going to be a period where there are already projects struggling with compensation in the pipeline. We understand some of the compensation options available, but the MRF isn't up and running. So we're very much in the space at the moment of what do we do in that interim space? How do we help those projects already stuck in the pipeline? Consider further which developments could benefit and how measures could be delivered. Energy Act 2023 enables the Secretary of State to make provisions and regulations for one or more MRFs to mirror in the secondary legislation. So I think the really interesting point about this last point, bullet, is unfortunately when you're dealing with legislation, you have inherent quite long time frames. If you're particularly going to make changes to the legislation themselves, you can be passing SIs, which are secondary legislations. It takes quite a long time. I was writing a submission to the Secretary of State last week and checked BBC News to see that the Secretary of State I was writing to had just resigned. It makes it tricky. How do you then change the document you're writing? Also, how does that change your approval timeframes? It can, a change like that can produce a delay of a month to something that you thought was on the cusp of being approved before it even hits Parliament. So we're really trying to find that balance between a long-term future for the consenting and compensation side, trying to, where possible as well, make sure there's a focus on, and we'll get to marine special prioritisation, on locations of wind farms, so we don't get to this point, so we have the avoidance and mitigation. Last slide. So the other side to it, we're trying to focus on what we can do in the short term about legislation, how legislation can focus in the long term, and then marine special prioritisation, our sister programme, is focusing on, okay, how do we collect the information we do have around constraints in the sea and have early conversations around trade-offs so we can understand where best to work with Crown and State to place wind farms and not get to the point where compensation is required.
Thank you, Ian. Ian raised a good deal of really high ambition areas that are being worked on across the DEFRA family at the moment, and I think it was really good to hear all of that, Ian. Thank you. Sort of in and around there are challenges with implementing all of that, and I think it's part of what we're doing here is recognizing that there's great work and these great ambitions are underway, and we're seeing that in Scotland too. But it's teasing it out. And one of the key things I picked out from what Ian was saying is the need for evidence to feed in and help inform a lot of these processes. So I think that's something where research can certainly help. Right. Well, we've got two more talks to help prepare us in terms of thinking of challenges in this area. Both of them are going to be online. So in a moment, we're going to bring up Tristan Bromley from the Crown Estate, and he is going to talk to us. Tristan's going to give us an update on the whole of seabed program. So we'll connect Tristan up for you there. You see you, Tristan?
Yep. Good morning,
Ready to go?
everybody.
Over.
Coming through. All right. In which case I will plow on. So I think, are those slides coming up on the screen? Yes. Great. Wonderful. All right. Yes. So as we were just saying, so I'm Tristan Bromley. I work at the Crown Estate in our spatial planning team, and I lead on our whole of seabed programme, which is what I will talk to today, and relating back into the theme of today around cumulative assessments impacts, how in the near future it can start feeding back into those conversations. So I know that you heard from two of my colleagues yesterday, so Olivia Thomas and Maddie King, who covered off how we as the Crown Estate are looking to take a long-term approach to our management of the seabed, working to identify and address some of those common challenges in UK waters, bringing industry together, and developing our information sharing across those challenges and different areas. And so in whole of seabed, as part of this, we're currently undertaking this work to digitally map the seabed resource needed to meet future demands, including those from nature, and through this enhance the coordination of how we manage future activities out to 2050. And so that in summary is the whole of seabed programme, which I'll go into more detail in a second. But in particular, what we think, while this evidence base and work can create an evidence base to support the future delivery across a range of marine uses, a key part of that will be considering how those views of the future can help inform our conversations around cumulative effect assessments. Because as we all know, those cumulative challenges are only going to get greater and greater as the seabed becomes busier out to 2050. And so what our whole seabed work does is provide us with that evidence base, including a wide ranging scenarios on how we could manage the seabed out to 2050, including the analysis, the potential scale and prime areas for individual sectors. And so this in turn allows us to start considering and taking further steps to managing any potential impacts, both through planning for future mitigation challenges, as well as looking at the potential to avoid some of those entirely. So that's why we've got the words whole of seabed up on the screen and how it links back into what we're talking about today. So move on to the next slide. Yeah. So firstly, to give a bit more detail about what the whole of seabed approach is and why we're undertaking it. So it constitutes cross-sector analysis of the demand on the seabed and the supply of resources across a range of sectors in English, Welsh and Northern Irish waters out to 2050. Not just out to 2050, but then broken down into 5-year chunks, so say 2030 to 35, 35 to 40, etc., to create this evidence base about cross-sector future use of the seabed to support and bound those future delivery decisions. So by creating those scenarios and having that wide range of futures, we hope to be able to show where we think the boundary cases of how we might use the seabed in future, where those boundary cases lie, and therefore start to ground some of the conversations we're having in more detail, and in particular in greater spatial specificity than before. So in how we describe whole of seabed, we both call it our development of an analytical capability as the Crown Estate, and then what it does is produce that evidence base as the product of that capability. So, for example, it's the same capability in whole of seabed, which develops the spatial analysis, which we feed through the government's Marine Spatial Prioritisation Programme, aiding policy development in that way. So we provide an evidence base through whole of seabed, and we want to make that evidence base as useful as possible to policymakers and those we work with on marine delivery. So how did we come to doing this? Why did we one day wake up and say we want to do whole of seabed? So to come back to Crown Estate as a whole, in evolving our strategy and bringing greater focus not only to the financial value we can create, but interpreting how we can create environmental and social value as well, with particular goals around supporting net zero and nature recovery at the heart of that. In thinking about how we then operationalize and achieve that strategy, a few things start to sort of go through our heads. Firstly, that we've got some deep expertise in spatial analysis, which sits at the core of whole of seabed. It is that spatial analysis that drives the core of it, and makes use of the whole business and all of the expertise spread across our sectoral teams, consenting teams, etc., and drawing that back into our spatial analysis team. So that has developed greatly over the past 2 decades, and through whole of seabed, we're now looking at really getting to the cutting edge of what we can do in that space internationally. Not only do we have this expertise in spatial analysis, but of course we work across administrations in English, Welsh and Northern Irish waters, meaning we're well-versed in taking those cross administration considerations into account in our work, and have that ability to convene stakeholders, not just the devolved administrations, but more widely on account of thinking in that way. And in addition to that, we have this cross-sectoral focus, some of which are listed on the left-hand side of this slide. So again, we need to think about how we can balance the needs of vastly different sectors over a long period of time. And that includes, through whole of seabed, thinking about nature recovery, not just as an objective, but equally, how do we support that as a sector in and of itself? And how do we bring that bespoke or more bespoke approach to think about how we achieve that objective? And then finally, at the Crown Estate, we're able to take a long-term view about all of these things. We can pick up this this ambition to generate evidence out to 2050, and we can run with that over decades and work with policy as it evolves and develops through that process. So moving on very quickly to cover what we mean when we say we do spatial analysis, because I was thinking it can sometimes sound a bit euphemistic when we talk about spatial analysis. What does looking for space look like? What do we actually mean when we say we're looking for good space? In essence, what we do in this team is think about it in these 4 broad categories. So firstly, constraints to conducting an activity. So that includes thinking about the technical resource area where we can do an activity. So things like water depth, sediment type, where can we physically put a turbine, for example. Hard constraints, so the locations that we think we definitely can't go and won't be able to go in the near future. So where at MOD firing, where's a firing range, for example, don't want to build anything there. Then soft constraints, which is essentially everything else. So a weighted analysis of everything else that is going on across our waters. So what's the density of fishing in a particular area? Where are the different densities of shipping lanes, for example? And so that acts to inform where we think areas are better or less well suited to a particular activity. Then delivery cost. So most notably, that has been the levelized cost of energy to date for offshore wind, where we've developed a lot in the past 5 to 10 years, the sophistication of those levelized cost of energy models. But increasingly, we're looking at in particular through whole of seabed, how we can look at that for other industries such as marine aggregates. So how can we build up those cost models to help inform where we think the cheaper areas to conduct an activity are. Then onshore infrastructure, again, most notably, that has been the grid in the past couple of years, which has drawn a lot of focus. So when we think about all of these activities offshore, how do they start? Where do they impact onshore as they come back to land? But not just grid, also increasingly we're thinking about ports and other aspects of the coastal portfolio we manage and those wider supply chains back on shore, which then links across to that final category of social and environmental value. So this, in looking at this category, it is it's an emerging area, and it's really thinking about what can we do to prioritize that creation of environmental or social value. So early days on that topic, but a lot of promising work underway. So finally, where are we at with the whole of seabed program? So we did a proof of concept phase through the first half of the year where we looked at a subset of sectors, so offshore wind, electricity cables, aggregates, telecoms, CCS and nature recovery. We then are now in a second phase where we've looked at those additional sectors in the second box, so pipelines, tidal energy, wave, interconnectors, aquaculture, gas storage. And so we're looking at integrating initial views of those and strengthening what we did in that phase one, because essentially we got through our proof of concept in a few months and thought, well, there's loads more we can immediately do to improve upon this. And now that we know that we have the capability to produce this type of evidence, then partner-led, so essentially the activities we don't lease for, and that if we wanted to look at the resource and demand for those in more detail, we would work with the relevant authorities, whether that's the NSTA, MMO, etc. And then future, everything else that's on our books to look at some point, but we have not had the opportunity to do so far. So a range of activities there. So to wrap all of this together, what we will get from this program is a series of spatial outputs which help to start bounding the range of outcomes for the seabed out to 2050. And so what we think we should be able to start doing in the near future is use that evidence base as a basis for conversations about future delivery, including those around cumulative impacts. For example, we can work with our consenting and environmental colleagues, other organisations on issues such as how we design our future renewable energy systems and generation, and using that holistic whole of seabed evidence base to support truly strategic cross-sector decisions in how we plan individual sectors. So really bringing that piece together and grounding everything we do through that uniform evidence base. So in conclusion, we're still near the beginning of that journey, but it's a really exciting period, and we hope to make really significant progress in the coming months and to make use of that capability as it develops iteratively over the coming years.
Thank you, Tristan. Lots of really interesting work going on there, trying to balance all the needs of the different industries there, Tristan. And you notice Tristan popped up a slide for questions at the end there. We're going to have questions just after our next speaker. I'm going to invite the in-person panel up here, and we're going to have the online attendees presumably on the screen. So questions in a moment, but one more bit of information for you around the challenges around cumulative effects assessments. Adrian Judd, who will be presenting a view from the ICES working groups on cumulative effects assessment. So over to Adrian now. We're going to bring him up on the screen. We can see you, Adrian.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So hopefully my slides will be coming.
Yep, just working its way through the wires onto the screen. There you go.
Brilliant.
Over to
Yep, thank you. Right, I will get going. So firstly, I will apologise for my colleague Daniel Wood, who was due to be giving this presentation, but unfortunately he's off sick, so you'll have to make do with me. Yes, I do dual approaches. So to one, give an overview, a couple of perspectives. So one from OSPAR and also from ICES. So firstly, I thought it'd be worth just sort of pausing for a little bit just to think about what do we actually mean by cumulative effects assessment. The definition that I've put up on the screen is one that we adopted early on from the in the OSPAR working group on cumulative effects, that we're looking at a systematic procedure to identify and evaluate the significance of effects from multiple sources or activities, and for providing an estimate on the overall expected human impact. And then importantly, that we're doing that in order to inform management measures. And it relates to looking at the causes, consequences, and pathways of those effects on the range of receptors. I think it's also worth sort of pausing to think about that there are different purposes and scales for cumulative effects assessment. So the first level is looking at things from a project level. So this is where we'd be looking at environmental impact assessment or habitats regulations assessments that have requirements to look at cumulative or in combination effects. To the next phase, we can look at things from a more sort of regional or strategic level. So that could be strategic environmental assessments or regional environmental assessments, where again, we're looking at it from in most part, looking at this from a sort of single sector perspective, and how that sector individually and cumulatively can impact different receptors. And then so the next level up is looking at things from marine plan level, where we are looking at multiple sectors and multiple receptors and how they interact. And then the last level, sort of broad level, is looking at things from a sort of more national or regional sea level. So that could equate to the assessments we do within sort of the UK Marine Strategy, the work that was done under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive across Europe, or things like the OSPAR Quality Status Report. I think it's worth sort of bearing in mind those differences, because the approaches that are applied may be different as we work through those, but each of them can be informed by the other approaches. Colin mentioned the ecosystem approach in his summary from yesterday. So from the work from the OSPAR Quality Status Report that was published in September this year, we've so an underlying principle there is the ecosystem approach, which in the North East Atlantic Environment Strategy is defined as the integrated management of human activities. It's based on the best available scientific knowledge on the ecosystem. It's there to identify and take action on drivers, activities, and pressures that adversely affect the health of marine ecosystems. And it also sort of brings in considerations of impacts and relationships on ecosystem goods and services, and also sort of takes into consideration cumulative effects. So in terms of considering how we would look about cumulative effects assessment for the quality status report in OSPAR, we thought we had to sort of pretty much build it around that ecosystem approach, and also recognizing within that definition, then we are sort of talking about the drivers behind the activities, the human activities, the pressures they exert, the changes in state, ecosystem state, the impacts that those changes have on ecosystem services, and then the wider sort of the management responses that are in place. So taking that sort of DAPSIA framework to guide and structure that sort of more systems approach for the assessment, which those elements were broadly covered in previous quality status reports, but as Colin said, it probably could have been done a lot better. This time around, I think we've taken sort of a bigger step forward to take that more sort of systems ecosystem approach, but there's still a long way we can go to improve on that. And then taking that framework, we've sort of broken that down into a schematic in terms of how we could work around things. So the broad premise here is we have different human activities which can exert pressures, which can lead to changes in ecosystem state. Those human activities occur to meet society's needs. So that could be food or energy or materials or security. But those state changes can also lead on to impacts on different ecosystem services, goods and benefits. And those changes then obviously then have consequences back to the drivers again. So it is a sort of cyclical process. But also recognizing that there are different management measures that can be put into place to either prevent those changes or if those changes have occurred to try and mitigate their effects. So trying to think about things in a much more joined up and sort of integrated way to apply that ecosystem approach. And then each of the thematic assessments in the quality status report have been structured around that sort of that DAPSIA framework. In order in sort of putting that into practice, so this is just one of the examples from the marine mammal thematic assessment. So we've got marine mammals here in the centre. We have a series of indicators that we use to identify and describe the state. There are a series of pressures that can be exerted that can actually change that state, and then a series of human activities which are contributing each of those pressures. And then those human activities have the various sort of socio-economic drivers that sit behind them. And then equally, any of those those changes in ecosystems, so those impacts on marine mammals, so that's the red boxes, can then lead to different impacts on a range of different ecosystem services. And then the sort of the white boxes are the different management measures that can be put in place on human activities or pressures to try and prevent them occurring or to avoid the impact, or if they have occurred to actually mitigate them on the right hand side. Then what we've sort of taken there, so for the activity, pressure and ecosystem component linkages, we've then applied a weighting to each of those connections, which is based on the spatial extent of the activity pressure combination, the frequency of its occurrence, and the likely degree of impact associated with those. So that's derived from a methodology from the EU ODEM project from a few years ago. And then what that sort of shows here is that it shows the relative contribution that each of the human activities have on the pressures, and then also the relative contribution that each of the pressures have on the ecosystem component. So in this instance, marine mammals. And there's also a weighting applied to the connections on ecosystem services to basically on a high, medium, low score in terms of the likelihood and the scale of impact. So in this particular instance, they all came out pretty equal. And then that exercise was repeated across each of the biodiversity thematic assessments to give us a range of those sort of overall sort of the sort of description of the collective pressures on those ecosystem components. Also within OSPAR, there is an offshore renewable energy development group that's working towards a strategic objective in the North East Atlantic Environment Strategy, which is to, by 2023, so to get some common principles, and they have now been published, so they were published earlier on in the year. But by 2024 to develop some guidance to facilitate sustainable development and of the scaling up of offshore wind, offshore renewable energy, but in the first instance focusing on offshore wind. They're working in terms of developing a cumulative effects assessment framework, taking a stepwise approach. So the first is to focus on a single activity, so offshore wind and associated pressures, and focusing on a single receptor, so marine birds. So you can already see there are parallels in terms of what's going on here, in terms of what Zoe was talking about previously and other speakers. The view then in further phases tends to build in other receptors, and then also to consider other stressors. The phase 1 work is currently being commissioned. There's a literature review on marine birds that's already been completed. The approach that's been taken is aiming to be as collaborative as it can be. So it is working with the cumulative effects group, so the work on that was being progressed for the quality status report that I've just been talking about, but also with the marine bird expert groups. And there are also links with the Greater North Sea Basin Initiative and the work stream on cumulative effects that's got to progress. very quickly, I'll just rattle through some things from an ICES perspective. So ICES have also developed a framework that they're working towards. I wouldn't expect you to go into all the detail to that, but I think just by summarising, it's broadly got a driver activity pressure state impacts on ecosystem services and response components to it. So there are lots of parallels and similarities there in terms of the work that we've developed within OSPAR. This slide and the next slide, the outputs have not yet been generated from the ICES group, but one of the chairs, Harry-Yen Piet, has published a couple of papers which help to illustrate the direction that's going in. So similarly, they've looked at the relationships between activities, pressures, and ecosystem components, applied a weighting mechanism to those, and to show the relative contribution of the activities to the pressures on those ecosystem state components. And they have amalgamated those. They have got a series of receptors rather than the individual ones that we had from an OSPAR stage. And then they've also linked those into different ecosystem services and the links to those. And the weighting framework has the same route as the approach we applied in OSPAR, but it is a slightly more sophisticated approach, and there is more level of detail to there, so we can sort of learn on that and build on that. And whilst it's broadly been set up as a sort of a non-spatial approach, the outputs can be applied spatially. So we can sort of, when we are looking about the different human activities and the pressures and the ecosystem components, we can build in sort of spatial information to sit behind that, with a view of generating risk of impact maps. And then last couple of slides. So I know I'm over time or getting over time, so apologies for that. But by taking this sort of ecosystem approach, then it does also lend itself to then sort of be further development into a natural capital approach. So by just by sort of considering some of the change in terminology, so rather than talking about ecosystem state, if we talk about the extent and condition of the ecosystem in the center, and the ecosystem services components can be expanded to consider the flow and use of those services, and to look at the asset accounts. And then the last slide, which I've just sort of, I won't go through in detail, but just there are synergies between the various work streams that we've got between OSPAR and ICES. There are some commonalities in the framework to apply things from a sort of national, regional C scale, that can help to inform things done at a more project level, to set that wider context. It demonstrates how we can use non-spatial approaches, but we can adapt those to bring into the spatial analyses. And also they've been developed around the evidence that we have to work with, rather than trying to develop a conceptual framework and then we're sort of struggling to run it because the data just isn't there. We've started with the data that we've got and then tried to build a framework to work with that. I will stop there. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Adrian, for sharing with us OSPAR and ICE's latest work in this area. If I can ask our two speakers in the room, please, to come back up, Ian and Zoe. And then on the screen here, if we can get back Adrian and Tristan, please. Take your pick. And we'd like to just, if I remind us that the people online will only know what you're saying if you use, if you speak into the microphone. So please do put your question into the microphone. Complex topic, lots of programs raised, an awful lot to talk about. Has anyone got any questions for starters? Yes, at the back there.
Thank you. So Jasmine Sharp from Natural Resources Wales. So we've had it's a complex issue, and yesterday, John and Kat talked about one of the real drivers is trying to reduce consenting timelines, trying to get there now. And so in the talks that we've had today, we've talked about the combination of marine net gain, changes to the habitats regulations. We're talking about having cumulative effects frameworks, multiple different cumulative effects frameworks being developed. We've got this program, we've got OWEC, We've got work being undertaken as part of the Energy Act by Department of Net Zero Energy Security Net Zero. We've got work being undertaken by the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities about environmental outcome reports, changing how we do EIA. So there's lots and lots of stuff that's going on that's making small changes or big changes all at once. Does this result in streamlining and genuinely increasing the pace of consenting? And is there anybody who's taken a step back and is looking at the end point and the bigger picture to say, where do we want to be in 5 years' time? And are we actually going to get there? Rather than everything all coming at once and being a mishmash that isn't really structured?
It's a really good question about everything, everywhere, all at once. Would any of our panel feel brave enough to take this one on?
I mean, as I've said, I'm at the pointy end. I'm an operational person. I'm kind of not a policy lead. But I think within the Scottish Government, what we're trying to do with projects such as the setting aside a policy in terms of our energy strategy, just transition, looking at a new national marine plan, looking at the sectoral plans, is to try to have a really plan-led approach so that we know where we're going in the future. Now, a lot of the changes you talked about, and I know we sit in meetings together about this, is very sort of England and Wales focused, and some of them apply to Scotland, some of them don't. It is a complicated landscape. But I think there's almost a kind of like, we have to give it all a bit of a go. Some of it will drop out as we go through the process. Those of us that have been around for a while, there's been lots of initiatives over the years, and some of them have worked and some of them haven't. But there's almost kind of like, you've got to kind of persevere with them, and some of them will get good results, some of them won't. So I suppose it's, I'm not sure that's an answer, but maybe it's a bit of a plea for patience and for trying our hardest on all of them, and to see which ones, end up with good results and which ones maybe fall by the wayside during the process.
It also plays, Zoe, to the fact that everything's happening now, isn't it? So there is a need that we do need to move.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like, I mean, it was a bit what I was saying yesterday. It might not be ideal, okay? We might not have the perfect solution at the moment, but it's almost kind of like, we've got to do something. I mean, it's a bit like Colin was saying. We've got to give something a go. And so I know it's frustrating that there's all these different initiatives going. I can promise you, I go to meetings and someone talks to me about another initiative and I'm like, where did that one come from? But, it's kind of having that positive kind of outlook that some of these will lead us down a path that helps us to get to where we want to be.
If I could come in as well on that, I think it's recognising that there is a lot going on. Again, this won't be an answer; it's just more of a comment on it. But I think it's just, we can be better at integrating some of those and having greater awareness in some of those different initiatives that are going on, and recognising that they are sometimes working at different scales, have slightly different objectives and outcomes, but there is still some relevance and some crossover between them. So I think the more we can do to try and make sure that we are in the room having the same conversations, thinking about those and building on them, and thinking about where the join up it could be, and then trying to work to integrate that so we are ending up with something that is more holistic but also more straightforward in terms of how we're applying it. So I think it's just trying to reduce the complication in terms of what we're doing by trying to make sure we are being more joined up and integrated where we can be.
That's great, Adrian. Would anyone else on the panel like to take that one as well?
I think one thing I'd say, and I appreciate your point, absolutely. Kowski's called Kaus because they're trying to come up with a name for offshore wind that didn't begin with an OW, because there's so many boards. I think there's two halves to the challenge. There's the interim, or what we've been calling the interim phase, and then there's the longer term vision. I think there are multiple long-term visions, and that's part of the problem, and that's both within bodies. So when different stakeholders have the different view of what would work, and then there is a few different bodies. So there's CAUSC, there's Pathways to Growth, there's OWEC, which is also connected. Are we doing well enough to have one view? Probably not. And I think that is a desire, I think there's a recognition and a desire from that. When we talk about here, when we talk about a pathway to growth, people recognise it and we're trying to have those conversations. What I do think has been quite effective is the cross-pollination. So the same people are sitting on different boards, they're having similar conversations. And I think everyone knows what it's like. You come to a place like this, you have a good conversation. Some of them impact the way you work, some of them get forgotten. I think because we're having the same conversation multiple times, it is actually starting to change the way each of those bodies is working. And I think we had a CAUSC lessons learned, I think at the start of this week, for been a year into the programme. And one of the things that stood out to me is some of the conversations we've had looking at the round 4 compensation planning, looking at Haunted 4, and when you're actually in those meetings talking about let's pull together a compensation plan, things get a little bit more pragmatic. When you're looking at that short term, you start to get a little bit more of a, and I think that's where we're getting some gains of speed and compensation. But I think there's more opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Ian. So with Adrian.
Can I just want to add one thing, and I was talking to some people about this yesterday. I wonder whether it's a time for, there's people around who remember a guy called Mike Elliott did a thing called a horrendogram years ago, and it was a kind of like, Adrian, you'll remember that, you know, and it's maybe time for a bit of an update to that horrendogram to actually show us how all these bodies fit together. So that's maybe something we'll think about if we can commission somehow between us.
I've heard that mentioned yesterday as well. So yeah, it's definitely brewing. Question in the front there, please, from John.
Can I just kind of respond to that a little bit as well? So to sort of answer the question directly, no, there isn't, and yes, there should be. I think that's a really, really important point, and I think that's kind of what we were trying to get at yesterday, Kat and I, is that there needs to be this strategic overall view of where we want to get there, and think about it in terms of, look at it from an ecosystem perspective. So I think Adrian's presentation, I thought that was really, really excellent, and put everything in terms of the effects and the impacts on the state really in the right perspective. And it's taking that perspective and putting offshore wind into that framework and understanding how it fits within the totality of human pressures is exactly how we need to progress. So I think having that long-term vision of where we want to be in 5 or 10 years, taking that ecosystem approach, understanding the risk associated with uncertainty and moving towards that vision is, and I think the thing is, I think this program potentially has the ability to make that impact, is to kind of, through all of this work that you're doing, is to make a recommendation that that is how things should be taken forward, and all the research you're doing should fit into that approach. So yeah, I think there needs to be that vision, and I think this program can play a really important role in driving that.
Thanks, John. We'll just open up for one more question. We've got time for one more. To David there.
Good morning. So my name is Veronica Uncono. I'm from the National Wildlife Federation in the United States, which is one of the oldest conservation organizations. And to comment on the plan comment that was just made, in the United States, we don't have planning, and that's created a lot of chaos. In fact, I think we would kill for half of the plans that I have seen proposed and presented on just at this conference. So just to give a little bit more context of how the United States is operating. But my question is for each of the presenters, can you elaborate on the socioeconomic considerations that each of the regulatory bodies that you typically participate in, how they're considering those impacts in the cumulative impacts assessment? Because in the United States, it's very much focused on pollution, because so many of our coastal communities are what we call environmental justice communities. They're the communities that traditionally have a lot of development already in them. So I'm curious to hear from this perspective in this room, what specific metrics y'all are considering, and what types of evaluations will you use to assess those metrics once they're used? Thank you.
It's a socioeconomic question. It has come up a little bit. I'm not sure we're that far down the road, but certainly ask our panel. Yes.
I mean, we have a set of guidance that we've been working on for some time within Scottish Government about how to do socioeconomic assessment. So it's not my specialist area, I would say. I could refer you to that guidance and to the consultation that's been done on that. I mean, I think that is we were talking about it a bit yesterday, it's the $1 million question about how you look at those impacts and cumulatively, how you pull them together. That was the wee flowchart that I put together. You can see where all the different socioeconomic impacts go to communities, to different individuals, to organizations. It's the different scales that's at. So I can't give you a kind of like detail on the metrics, but what I can do is if you come and find me later, I can point you towards our draft guidance. And then we have at a strategic level, we have socioeconomic assessments of all of those plans that I've been talking about. So our national marine plan will have an impact assessment. It'll have our sectoral plan. Those are already in draft and being looked at. So I can point you towards those as well. That might help you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got a similar answer to Zoe in terms of our team's very much focused on the HRA and MCZ side, which is ecological impact. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about. I do know it's, again, we have evolving guidance, and I know it's quite a big focus in terms of how to better include communities and the socioeconomic impact into not actually just the EIA side, but also into the consenting, leasing, and particularly the conversation I've been involved in around cabling and routing of cabling. So it's a focus. I'm not the right person for the answer, but I'll take it away.
I wonder just briefly if either Tristan or Adrian are considering socioeconomic impacts in whole of seabed or OSPAR. Maybe whole of seabed first, Tristan.
Yeah, I can give a really quick snapshot of what we're looking at. I mean, we look at when we build up the analysis, there are sort of a few different avenues that we look through to access that. Is firstly when we look at when we analyze different seabed users in comparison to then doing a particular activity in a particular area, we think about that through how do we weight those activities in terms of how they might have economic, social, or environmental effects. So there's that weighting process that we use, and that is reliant on, a lot of this always comes back to the quality of data we have to feed in. But we look at it through that weighting process when we do constraint analysis. But then overall, when we're looking at scenarios in whole of seabed, one of the key questions we think about is how do we create, say, a more cost-focused scenario or a more environmentally focused scenario? Or, I mean, in reality, we really want to sort of strike the balance across all three, but when we're looking at the sort of extreme ends to help bound some of those extremes, how do we make a socially economic, how do we sort of get at that focus through the scenarios? In short, it's really difficult, and we're doing a lot of work in live time on really scoping out some of the metrics that might, particularly in terms of spatial data, that might be helpful to that process. So, and it's the sort of golden question: how do we link the social and socio-economic value created by a wind farm 100 kilometers offshore back to some coastal communities onshore? And how do we look at that at, firstly, how do we think about that at the stage of spatial modeling? And then how do we see that value created through the chain of planning, leasing, tendering, operations through the lifetime of that asset and ensure that that is fulfilled? But I think from the sort of evidence creation point of view, a lot of it comes back to data and thinking about what can we usefully look at through a spatial lens, and to be honest, what is not usefully looked at through a spatial lens, because we don't want to try and look at it all through a whole of seabed, but it's a key part of the analysis and one that we're looking to develop quite a lot.
Thanks, Tristan. And just quickly, if you can, Adrian, because we're all due a break now, just to give us a view from OSPAR. Like, is that being considered in That's your framework that you've shown.
Yeah, so both OSPAR and ICES have social and economic expert groups. Historically, they've tended to work in their own bubbles, I think it's fair to say. But what we've tried to do within the work I was talking about from the quality status report this time is to actually much more have that more integrated. So we've got the environmental economists, the social scientists, and the ecologists and the chemists in the same room to talk about the issues up front and trying to pull that together in a single assessment. So rather than have a sort of chapter on the economic and social analysis that's hidden away that people may not get to, is actually there, spoken about alongside the ecosystem change, the activities and the pressures that are causing that change together. So yeah, I think part of it's getting people in the same room together to have the conversation, but also trying to make sure that the vocabularies are understood because they are very different between the different experts you've got there. So you need to make sure you've got that I think it was on Colin's slide as well earlier on, getting that collective understanding in terms of what the aims are, what the outcomes are, and how the procedures can actually fit together, because they're not too far apart once you actually get to be talking the same language.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for your questions and for your insights. And I'd also like to thank the panel. So thanks, everybody.